Chapter 3. We tumbled through the black woods for what seemed like hours. No moon or movement of stars by which to judge the passing of time. The sound of men shouting and dogs barking wheeled around us as we ran, menacing us from everywhere and nowhere. To throw the dogs off our scent, we waded into an icy stream and followed it until our feet went numb, and when we crossed out of it again, it felt like I was stumbling along on prickling stumps. After a time, we began to fail. Someone moaned in the dark. Olive and Claire started to fall behind, so Bronwyn hefted them into her arms, but then she couldn't keep up either. Finally, when Horace tripped over a root and fell to the ground, and then lay there begging for a rest, we all stopped. "Up, you lazy sod," Enoch hissed at him, but he was wheezing too, and then he leaned against a tree to catch his breath, and the fight seemed to go right out of him. We were reaching the limit of our endurance. We had to stop. "It's no use running in circles in the dark like this anyway," said Emma. "We could just as easily end up right back where we started." "We'll be able to make better sense of this forest in the light of day," said Millard. "Provided we live that long," said Enoch. A light rain hissed down. Fiona made a shelter for us by coaxing a ring of trees to bend their lower branches together, petting their bark and whispering to their trunks until the branches meshed to form a watertight roof of leaves, just high enough for us to sit beneath. We crawled in and lay listening to the rain and the distant barking of dogs. Somewhere in the forest, men with guns were still hunting us. Alone with our thoughts, I'm sure each of us was wondering the same thing. What might happen to us if we were caught? Claire began to cry, softly at first, but then louder and louder, until both of her mouths were bawling, and she could hardly catch a breath between sobs. "Get a hold of yourself," Enoch said. "They'll hear you, and then we'll all have something to cry about." "They're going to feed us to their dogs," she said. "They're going to shoot holes in us and take Miss Peregrine away." Bronwyn scooted next to her and wrapped the little girl in a bear hug. "Please, Claire, you've got to think about something else." I'm trying," she wailed. "Try harder." Claire squeezed her eyes shut, drew in a deep breath, and held it until she looked like a balloon about to pop, then burst into a fit of gasping cough sobs that were louder than ever. Enoch clapped his hands over her mouths. "Shh. I'm sorry," she blubbered. "Maybe if I could hear a story, one of the tales." "Not this again," said Millard. "I'm beginning to wish we'd lost those damn books at sea with the rest of our things." Miss Peregrine spoke up, inasmuch as she was able to, hopping atop Bronwyn's trunk and tapping it with her beak. Inside, along with the rest of our meager possessions, were the tales. "I'm with Miss P," said Enoch. "It's worth a try. Anything to stop her bawling." "All right then, little one," Bronwyn said. "But just one tale, and you've got to promise to stop crying." "I promise," Claire sniffled. Bronwyn opened the trunk and pulled out a waterlogged volume of Tales of the Peculiar. Emma scooted close and lit the tiniest wisp of flame on her fingertip to read by. Then Miss Peregrine, apparently impatient to pacify Claire, took one edge of the book's cover in her beak and opened it to a seemingly random chapter. In a hushed voice, Bronwyn began to read. Once upon a peculiar time, in a forest deep and ancient, there roamed a great many animals. There were rabbits and deer and foxes, just as there are in every forest. But there were animals of a less common sort, too, like stilt-legged grim bears and two-headed lynxes and talking emu raffs. These peculiar animals were a favorite target of hunters, who loved to shoot them and mount them on walls and show them off to their hunter friends, but loved even more to sell them to zookeepers who would lock them in cages and charge money to view them. Now, you might think it would be far better to be locked in a cage than to be shot and mounted upon a wall, but peculiar creatures must roam free to be happy, and after a while, the spirits of caged ones wither, and they began to envy their wall-mounted friends. "This is a sad, sorry story," Claire groused. "Tell a different one." "I like it," said Enoch. "Tell more about the shooting and mounting." Bronwyn ignored them both. "Now this was an age when giants still roamed the earth," she went on, "as they did in the long-ago Alden times, though they were few in number and diminishing. And it just so happened that one of these giants lived near the forest, and he was very kind and spoke very softly and ate only plants, and his name was Cuthbert. One day, Cuthbert came into the forest to gather berries, and there saw a hunter hunting an emu raff. Being the kindly giant that he was, Cuthbert picked up the little raff by the scruff of its long neck, and by standing up to his full height on tiptoe, which he rarely did, because it made all his old bones crackle, Cuthbert was able to reach up very high and deposit the emu raff on a mountain top, well out of danger. Then, just for good measure, he squashed the hunter to jelly between his toes. Word of Cuthbert's kindness spread throughout the forest, and soon peculiar animals were coming to him every day, asking to be lifted up to the mountain top and out of danger. And Cuthbert said, "I'll protect you, little brothers and sisters. All I ask in return is that you talk to me and keep me company. There aren't many giants left in the world, and I get lonely from time to time." And they said, "Of course, Cuthbert, we will." So every day, Cuthbert saved more peculiar animals from the hunters, lifting them up to the mountaintop by the scruffs of their necks, until there was a whole peculiar menagerie up there. And the animals were happy there, because they could finally live in peace, and Cuthbert was happy too, because if he stood on his tiptoes and rested his chin on the top of the mountain, he could talk to his new friends all he liked. Then one morning, a witch came to see Cuthbert. He was bathing in a little lake in the shadow of the mountain when she said to him, "I'm terribly sorry, but I've got to turn you into stone now." "Why would you do something like that?" asked the giant. "I'm very kindly, a helping sort of giant." And she said, "I was hired by the family of the hunter you squashed." "Ah," he replied, "forgot about him." "I'm terribly sorry," the witch said again, and then she waved a birch branch at him, and poor Cuthbert turned to stone. All of a sudden, Cuthbert became very heavy, so heavy that he began to sink into the lake. He sank and didn't stop sinking until he was covered in water all the way up to his neck. His animal friends saw what was happening, and though they felt terrible about it, they decided they could do nothing to help him. "I know you can't save me," Cuthbert shouted up to his friends, "but at least come and talk to me. I'm stuck down here, and so very lonely." "But if we come down, the hunters will shoot us," they called back. Cuthbert knew they were right, but still he pleaded with them. "Talk to me," he cried. "Please come and talk to me." The animals tried singing and shouting to poor Cuthbert from the safety of their mountaintop, but they were too distant and their voices too small, so that, even to Cuthbert and his giant ears, they sounded quieter than the whisper of leaves in the wind. "Talk to me," he begged. "Come and talk to me." But they never did, and he was still crying when his throat turned to stone like the rest of him. The end. Bronwyn closed the book. Claire looked appalled. That's it? Enoch began to laugh. That's it, Bronwyn said. That's a terrible story, said Claire. Tell another one. A story's a story, said Emma, and now it's time for bed. Claire pouted, but she had stopped crying, so the tale had served its purpose. Tomorrow's not likely to be any easier than today was, said Millard. We'll all need the rest that we can get. We gathered cuts of springy moss to use as pillows, Emma drying the rain from them with her hands before we tucked them under our heads. Lacking blankets, we nestled together for warmth. Bronwyn cuddling the small ones, Fiona entangled with Hugh, whose bees came and went from his open mouth as he snored, keeping watch over their sleeping master. Horace and Enoch shivering with their backs to one another, too proud to snuggle. Myself with Emma. I lay on my back, and she in the crook of my arm, head on my chest, her face so invitingly close to mine that I could kiss her forehead any time I liked. And I wouldn't have stopped, except that I was tired as a dead man, and she was as warm as an electric blanket, and pretty soon I was asleep, and dreaming pleasant, forgettable nothings. I never remember nice dreams. Only the bad ones stick. It was a miracle that I could get sleep at all, given the circumstances. Even here, running for our lives, sleeping exposed, facing death. Even here, in her arms, I was able to find some measure of peace. Watching over us all, her black eyes shining in the dark, was Miss Peregrine. Though damaged and diminished, she was still our protector. The night turned raw, and Claire began to shake and cough. Bronwyn nudged Emma awake and said, Miss Bloom, the little ones need you. I'm afraid she's taking ill. And with a whispered apology, Emma slipped out of my arms to go and attend to Claire. I felt a twinge of jealousy, then guilt for being jealous of a sick friend. So I lay alone, feeling irrationally forsaken, and stared into the dark, more exhausted than I had ever been, and yet unable now to sleep, listening to the others shift and moan in the grip of nightmares that could not have equaled the one that we would likely wake to. And eventually the dark peeled back layer by layer, and with imperceptible gradations the sky feathered to a delicate pale blue. At dawn, we crawled from our shelter. I picked moss out of my hair and tried in vain to brush the mud from my pants, but succeeded only in smearing it, making me look like some bog creature got sick from the earth. I was hungry in a way I'd never experienced, my belly gnawing at itself from the inside, and I ached just about everywhere it was possible to ache, from rowing and running and sleeping on the ground. Still, a few mercies prevailed. Overnight, the rain had let up. The day was warming by degrees, and we seemed to have evaded the whites and their dogs, at least for the time being. Either they'd stopped barking, or we were too far away to be heard. In doing so, we'd gotten ourselves hopelessly lost. The forest was no easier to navigate by day than it had been in the dark. Green-bowed firs stretched away in endless, disordered rows, each direction a mirror of the others. The ground here was a carpet of fallen leaves that hid any tracks we might have made the night before. We'd woken in the heart of a green labyrinth without a map or a compass, and Miss Peregrine's broken wing meant she couldn't fly above the tree line to guide us. Enoch suggested we raise Olive above the trees like we had in the fog, but we didn't have any rope to hold her, and if she slipped and fell into the sky, we'd never get her back again. Claire was sick and getting sicker, and lay curled in Bronwyn's lap, sweat beading her forehead despite a chill in the air. She was so skinny I could count her ribs through her dress. "Will she be all right?" I asked. She's feverish, Bronwyn said, pressing a hand to the girl's cheek. She needs medicine. First, we'll have to find our way out of this accursed forest, said Millard. First, we should eat, said Enoch. Let's eat and discuss our options. What options? Said Emma. Pick a direction and we'll walk in it. Anyone's as good as another. In sullen silence, we sat and ate. I've never tasted dog food, but I'm sure this was worse. Brownish squares of congealed meat fat from rusted tins, which, lacking utensils, we dug out with our fingers. I packed 5 salted game hens and 3 tins of foie gras with cornichons, Horace said bitterly, and this is what survives our shipwreck? He held his nose and dropped a gelatinous nugget down his throat without chewing. I think we're being punished. For what? Emma said. We've been perfect angels. Well, most of us. The sins of past lives, maybe. I don't know. Peculiars don't have past lives, said Millard. We live them all at once. We finished quickly, buried our empty tins, and prepared to go. Just as we were about to, Hugh burst through a thicket of bushes into our makeshift camp. Bees circling his head in an agitated cloud. He was out of breath with excitement. Where have you been? Enoch demanded. I needed some privacy to attend to my morning never-you-minds, Hugh said, and I found... Who gave you permission to be out of visual range? Enoch said. We nearly left without you. Who says I need permission? Anyway, I saw... You can't just wander away like that. What if you'd gotten lost? We're already lost. You ignoramus, what if you couldn't find your way back? I left a trail of bees like I always do. Would you kindly let him finish? Emma shouted. Thank you, said Hugh. And then he turned and pointed back the way he'd come. I saw water, quite a lot of it through the trees there. Emma's face clouded. She said, We're trying to get away from the sea, not back to it. We must have doubled back on ourselves in the night. We followed Hugh back the way he'd come, Bronwyn carrying Miss Peregrine on her shoulder and poor sick Claire in her arms. After 100 yards, a glisten of gray ripples appeared beyond the trees, some wide body of water. Oh, this is just awful, said Horace. They've chased us right back into their arms. I don't hear any soldiers, said Emma. In fact, I don't hear anything at all. Not even the ocean. Enoch said, That's because it's not the ocean, you dolt. And he stood up and ran toward the water. When we caught up with him, he was standing with his feet planted in wet sand, looking back at us with a self-satisfied I told you so grin. He'd been right. This wasn't the sea. It was a misty gray lake, wide and ringed with firs. Its calm surface smooth as slate. But its most distinguishing feature was something I didn't notice right away. Not until Claire pointed out a large rock formation jutting from the shallows nearby. My eyes skimmed it at first, but then went back for a second glance. There was something eerie about it, and decidedly familiar. It's the giant from the story, said Claire, pointing from her place in Bronwyn's arms. It's Cuthbert. Bronwyn stroked her head. Shh, honey, you've got fever. Don't be ridiculous, said Enoch. It's just a rock. But it wasn't. Though wind and rain had worn its features some, it looked just like a giant who'd sunk up to its neck in the lake. You could see clearly that it had a head and a neck and a nose and even an Adam's apple. and some scrubby trees were growing atop it like a crown of wild hair. But what was really uncanny was the position of its head, thrown back with its mouth open, as if, like the giant in the story we'd heard last night, it had turned to stone while crying out to its friends on the mountaintop. "And look," said Olive, pointing at a rocky bluff rising in the distance. "That must be Cuthbert's Mountain." "Giants are real," Claire murmured, her voice weak but full of wonder. "And so are the tales." "Let's not jump to absurd conclusions," said Enoch. "What's more likely, that the writer of the tale we read last night was inspired by a rock that just happened to be shaped like a giant head, or that this head-shaped rock was really a giant?" "You take the fun out of everything," said Olive. "I believe in giants, even if you don't." "The tales are just tales, and nothing more," Enoch grumbled. "Funny," I said. "That's exactly what I thought all of you were before I met you." Olive laughed. "Jacob, you're silly. You really thought we were made up?" "Of course. And even after I met you, I still did for a while. Like maybe I was losing my mind." "Real or not, it's an incredible coincidence," said Millard, "to have been reading that story just last night and then happen upon the very bit of geography that had inspired it the next morning. What are the chances?" "I don't think it's coincidence," Emma said. "Miss Peregrine opened the book herself, remember? She must have chosen that story on purpose." Bronwyn turned to look at the bird on her shoulder and said, "Is that right, Miss P?" "Why?" "Because it means something," said Emma. "Absolutely," said Enoch. "It means we should go and climb that bluff. Then maybe we'll see a way out of this forest." "I mean, the tale means something," said Emma. "In the story, what was it the giant wanted, that he asked for over and over again?" "Someone to talk to," Olive answered like an eager student. "Exactly," said Emma. "So if he wants to talk, let's hear what he has to say." And with that, she waded into the lake. We watched her go, slightly perplexed. "Where's she heading?" said Millard. He seemed to be asking me. I shook my head. "We've got whites chasing us," Enoch shouted after her. "We're desperately lost. What on bird's green earth are you thinking?" "I'm thinking peculiarly," Emma shouted back. She sloshed through the shallows to the base of the rock, then climbed up its jaw and peered into its open mouth. "Well," I called, "what do you see?" "Don't know," she replied. "Looks like it goes down a long way, though. I'd better get a closer look." Emma hoisted herself into the giant's stone mouth. "You better come down from there before you get hurt," shouted Horace. "You're making everyone anxious." "Everything makes you anxious," Hugh said. Emma tossed a rock down the giant's throat, listening for whatever sound came back. She started to say, "I think it might be a..." But then she slipped on loose gravel, and her last word was lost as she scrambled and caught herself before she could fall. "Be careful," I shouted, my heart racing. "Wait, I'm coming too." I splashed into the lake after her. "It might be a what?" called Enoch. "Only one way to find out," Emma said excitedly. And climbed farther into the giant's mouth. "Wait," I shouted again. "Oh, Lord," said Horace, "there she goes." But she was gone already, disappeared down the giant's throat. The giant appeared even larger up close than it had from the shore, and peering down its dark throat, I swore I could almost hear old Cuthbert breathing. I cupped my hands and called Emma's name. My own voice came echoing back. The others were wading into the lake now too, but I couldn't wait for them. What if she was in trouble down there? So I gritted my teeth, lowered my legs into the dark, and let go. I fell for a long time, a full second, then splash, a plunge into water so cold it made me gasp, all my muscles constricting at once. I had to remind myself to tread water or sink. I was in a dim, narrow chamber filled with water, with no way back up the giant's long, smooth throat. No rope, no ladder, no footholds. I shouted for Emma, but she was nowhere around. Oh God, I thought, she's drowned. But then something tickled my arms, and bubbles began breaking all around me. And a moment later, Emma broke the surface, gasping for breath. She looked okay by the pale light. "What are you waiting for?" she said, slapping the water with her hand, like she wanted me to dive down with her. "Come on." "Are you insane?" I said. "We're trapped in here." "Of course we're not," she said. Bronwyn's voice called from above. "Hello! I hear you down there. What have you found?" "I think it's a loop entrance," Emma called back. "Tell everyone to jump in and don't be afraid. Jacob and I will meet you on the other side." And then she took my hand, and though I didn't quite understand what was going on, I drew a deep breath and let her pull me underwater. We flipped and scissor-kicked downward toward a person-sized hole in the rock through which a gleam of daylight was visible. She pushed me inside and then came after, and we swam through a shaft about 10 feet long and then out into the lake. Above us, I could see its rippling surface, and above that, the blue refracted sky. And as we rose toward it, the water warmed dramatically. Then we broke into the air and gasped for breath, and instantly I could feel that the weather had changed. It was hot and muggy now, and the light had changed to that of a golden afternoon. The depth of the lake had changed, too. Now it came all the way to the giant's chin. "See?" Emma said, grinning. "We're someone else." And just like that, we'd entered a loop, abandoned a mild morning in 1940 for a hot afternoon in some other, older year, though it was difficult to tell just how much older, here in the forest, away from the easily datable cues of civilization. One by one, the other children surfaced around us, and seeing how much things had changed, had their own realizations. "Do you realize what this means?" Millard squealed. He was splashing around, turning in circles, out of breath with excitement. "It means there's secret knowledge embedded in the tales." "Not so useless now, are they?" said Olive. "Oh, I can't wait to analyze and annotate them," said Millard, rubbing his hands together. "Don't you dare write in my book, Millard Nullings," said Bronwyn. "But what is this loop?" asked Hugh. "Who do you think lives here?" Olive said, "Cuthbert's animal friends, of course." Enoch rolled his eyes, but stopped short of saying what he was probably thinking. It's just a story. Maybe because his mind was starting to change too. "Every loop has an imbrine," said Emma. "Even mystery loops from storybook tales. So let's go and find her." "All right," said Millard. "Where?" "The only place the story made mention of aside from this lake was that mountain," Emma said, indicating the bluff beyond the trees. "Who's ready to do some climbing?" We were tired and hungry, every one of us, but finding the loop had given us a burst of new energy. We left the stone giant behind and set off through the woods toward the foot of the bluff, our clothes drip-drying quickly in the heat. As we neared the bluff, the ground began to slope upward, and then a well-worn path appeared, and we followed it up and up through clusters of brushy firs and winding rocky passages until the path became so vertical in places that we had to go on all fours, clawing at the angled ground to pull ourselves forward. "There'd better be something wonderful at the end of this trail," said Horace, dabbing sweat from his forehead. "A gentleman does not perspire." The path narrowed to a ribbon, the ground rising sharply on our right side and dropping away on the left, a carpet of green treetops spreading beyond it. "Hug the wall," Emma warned. "It's a long way down." Just glancing at the drop-off made me dizzy. Suddenly, it seemed, I had developed a new and stomach-clenching fear of heights, and it took all my concentration simply to put one foot in front of the other. Emma touched my arm. "Are you all right?" she whispered. "You look pale." I lied and said I was, and succeeded in faking all rightness for exactly 3 more twists in the path, at which point my heart was racing and my legs shaking so badly that I had to sit down, right there in the middle of the narrow path, blocking everyone behind me. "Oh dear," Hugh muttered. "Jacob's cracking up." "I don't know what's wrong with me," I muttered. I'd never been afraid of heights before, but now I couldn't so much as look off the edge of the path without my stomach doing flips. Then something terrible occurred to me. What if this wasn't a fear of heights I was feeling, but of hollows? It couldn't be, though. We were inside of a loop where hollows couldn't go. And yet, the more I studied the feeling churning in my gut, the more convinced I became that it wasn't the drop itself that bothered me, but something beyond it. I had to see for myself. Everyone chattered anxiously in my ear, asking what was the matter. Was I okay? I shut out their voices, tipped forward on my hands, and crawled toward the edge of the path. The closer I got, the worse my stomach felt, like it was being clawed to shreds from the inside. Inches away, I pressed my chest flat to the ground and reached out to hook my fingers over the ledge, then dragged myself forward until I could peek over it. It took my eyes a moment to spot the hollow. At first, it was just a shimmer against the craggy mountainside, a quivering spot in the air like heat waves rising from a hot car, an error, barely detectable. This was how they looked to normals and to other peculiars, to anyone who could not do what I did. Then I actually experienced my peculiar ability coming to life. Very quickly, the churning in my belly contracted and focused into a single point of pain, and then, in a way I can't fully explain, it became directional, lengthening from a point into a line, from one dimension to 2. The line, like a compass needle, pointed diagonally at that faltering spot 100 yards below and to the left on the mountainside, the waves and shimmers of which began to gather and coalesce into solid black mass, a humanoid thing made from tentacles and shadow, clinging to the rocks. And then it saw me see it, and its whole awful body drew taut. Hunkering close against the rocks, it unhinged its saw-toothed mouth and let loose an ear-splitting shriek. My friends didn't need me to describe what I was seeing. The sound alone was enough. "Hollow!" someone shouted. "Run!" shouted another, belaboring the obvious. I scrambled back from the ledge and was pulled to my feet, and then we were all running in a pack, not down the mountain, but up it, farther into the unknown rather than back toward the flat ground and loop exit that lay behind us, but it was too late to turn back. I could feel the hollow leaping from boulder to crab up the cliffside, but away from us, down the path, to cut us off in case we tried to run past it down the mountain. It was trapping us. This was new. I'd never been able to track a hollow with anything other than my eyes before. But now I felt that little compass needle inside me pointing behind us, and I could almost picture the creature scrambling toward flat ground. It was as if, upon seeing the hollow, I'd planted a sort of homing beacon in it with my eyes. We raced around a corner, my fleeting fear of heights now apparently gone, and were confronted by a smooth wall of rock, 50 feet high at least. The path ended here. All around us the ground fell away at crazy angles. The wall had no ladders, no handholds. We searched frantically for some other way, a secret passage in the rock, a door, a tunnel. But there was none, and no way forward but up. And no way up, apparently, other than via hot air balloon, or the helping hand of probably a mythical giant. Panic took hold. Miss Peregrine began to screech, and Claire to cry as Horace stood and wailed, "This is the end. We're all going to die." The rest looked for last-ditch ways to save ourselves. Fiona dragged her hands along the wall, searching for crevices that might contain soil from which she could grow a vine or something else we could climb. Hugh ran to the edge of the path and peered over the drop-off. We could jump only if we had a parachute. "I can be a parachute," said Olive. "Take hold of my legs." But it was a long way down, and at the bottom it was dark and dangerous forest. It was better, Bronwyn decided, to send Olive up the rock face than down the mountain. And with limp, feverish Claire in one arm, Bronwyn led Olive by the hand to the wall. "Give me your shoes," she said to Olive. "Take Claire and Miss P and get to the top as quick as you can." Olive looked terrified. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she cried. "You've got to try, little magpie. You're the only one who can keep them safe." And she knelt and set Claire down on her feet, and the sick girl tottered into Olive's arms. Olive squeezed her tight, slipped off her leaden shoes, and then, just as they began to rise, Bronwyn transferred Miss Peregrine from her shoulder to the top of Olive's head. Weighed down, Olive rose very slowly. It was only when Miss Peregrine began to flap her good wing and pull Olive up by the hair, Olive yelping and kicking her feet, that the three of them really took off. The hollow had nearly reached level ground. I knew it was surely as if I could see it with my eyes. Meanwhile, we scoured the ground for anything that might be used as a weapon, but all we could find were pebbles. "I can be a weapon," said Emma, and she clapped her hands and drew them apart, an impressive fireball roaring to life between them. "And don't forget about my bees," said Hugh, opening his mouth to let them out. "They can be fierce when provoked." Enoch, who always found a way to laugh at the most inappropriate times, let out a big guffaw. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Pollinate it to death?" Hugh ignored him, turning to me instead. "You'll be our eyes, Jacob. Just tell us where the beast is and we'll sting his brains out." My compass needle of pain told me it was on the path now, and the way its venom was expanding to fill me meant it was closing in fast. "Any minute now," I said, pointing to the bend in the path we'd come around. "Get ready." If not for the adrenaline flooding my system, the pain would have been totally debilitating. We assumed fight-or-flight positions, some of us crouching with fists raised like boxers, others like sprinters before the starting gun, though no one knew which way to run. "What a depressing and inauspicious end to our adventures," said Horace. "Devoured by a hollow in some Welsh backwater." I thought they couldn't enter loops, said Enoch. How the hell did it get in here? It would seem they have evolved, said Millard. Who gives a chuck how it happened? Emma snapped. It's here and it's hungry. Then, from above us, a small voice cried, Look out below! And I craned my neck to see Olive's face pull back and disappear over the top of the rock wall. A moment later, something like a long rope came sailing over the ledge. It unreeled and snapped taut, and then a net unfurled at the end of it and smacked against the ground. Hurry, came Olive's voice again. There's a lever up here. Everyone grab hold of the net and I'll pull it. We ran to the net, but it was tiny, hardly large enough for two. Pinned to the rope at eye level was a photograph of a man inside the net, this very net, with his legs folded in front of him and hanging just above the ground before a sheer rock face. This very rock face. On the back of the photo, a message was printed. Only access to menagerie. Climb inside. Weight limit, 1 rider. Strictly enforced. This contraption was some sort of primitive elevator, meant for 1 rider at a time, not 8. But there was no time to use it as intended, so we all dogpiled onto it, sticking our arms and legs through its holes, clinging to the rope above it, attaching ourselves any way we could. Take us up, I shouted, the hollow very close now, the pain extraordinary. For a few endless seconds, nothing happened. The hollow bolted around the bend, using its muscular tongues like legs, its atrophied human limbs hanging useless. Then a metallic squeal rang out. The rope pulled taut, and we lurched into the air. The hollow had nearly closed the distance between us. It galloped with jaws wide open, as if to collect us between its teeth, the way a whale feeds on plankton. We weren't quite halfway up the wall when it reached the ground below us, looked up, and squatted like a spring about to uncoil. It's going to jump, I shouted. Pull your legs into the net. The hollow drove its tongues into the ground and sprang upward. We were rising fast, and it seemed like the hollow would miss us, but just as it reached the apex of its jump, one of its tongues shot out and lassoed Emma around the ankle. Emma screamed and kicked at it with her other foot as the net came to a jolting stop, the pulley above too weak to raise all of us and the hollow too. Get it off me, Emma shouted. Get it off, get it off, get it off! I tried kicking at it too, but the hollow's tongue was as strong as woven steel, and the tip was covered in hundreds of wriggling sucker cups, so that anyone who tried to pry the tongue off would only get stuck to it themselves. And then the hollow was reeling itself up, its jaws inching closer until we could smell its stinking grave breath. Emma shouted for someone to hold her, and with one hand I grabbed the back of her dress. Bronwyn let go of the net entirely, clinging to it with just her legs, then threw her arms around Emma's waist. Then Emma let go too, Bronwyn and I being all that kept her from falling, and with her hands now free, she reached down and clapped them around the tongue. The hollow shrieked. The sucker cups along its tongue withered, and reeking black smoke hissed from its flesh. Emma squeezed harder and closed her eyes and howled, not a cry of pain, I thought, but a kind of war cry, until the hollow was forced to release, its injured tentacle unslithering from around her ankle. There was a surreal moment where it was no longer the hollow who was holding Emma, but Emma who was holding the hollow. The thing writhing and shrieking below us, the acrid smoke of its burned flesh filling our noses, until finally we had to shout at her to let go. And Emma's eyes flew open again, and she seemed to remember where she was, and pulled her hands apart. The hollow tumbled away from us, grasping at empty space as it fell. We rocketed up and away in the net. The tension that had been holding us down suddenly released, and soaring over the lip of the wall, we collapsed in a heap on top of it. Olive, Claire, and Miss Peregrine were waiting there for us, and as we extricated ourselves from the net and stumbled away from the cliff's edge, Olive cheered, Miss Peregrine screeched and beat her good wing, and Claire raised her head from where she'd been lying on the ground and gave a weak smile. We were giddy, and for the first time in as many days, stunned to be alive. "That's twice you've saved our necks, little magpie," Bronwyn said to Olive. "And Miss Emma, I already knew you were brave, but that was beyond anything." Emma shrugged it off. "It was him or me," she said. "I can't believe you touched it," said Horace. Emma wiped her hands on her dress, held them to her nose, and made a face. "I just hope this smell comes off soon," she said. "That beast stank like a landfill." "How's your ankle?" I asked her. "Does it hurt?" She knelt and pushed down her sock to reveal a fat, red welt ringing it. "Not too bad," she said, touching the ankle gingerly. But when she stood up again and put weight on it, I caught her wincing. "A lot of help you were," Enoch growled at me. "Run away," says the Hollow Slayer's grandson. "If my grandfather had run from the hollow that killed him, he might still be alive," I said. "It's good advice." I heard a thud from beyond the wall we'd just scaled, and the feeling churned up inside me again. I went to the ledge and looked over. The hollow was alive and well at the base of the wall, and busy punching holes in the rock with its tongues. "Bad news," I said. "The fall didn't kill it." In a moment, Emma was at my side. "What's it doing?" I watched it twist one of its tongues into a hole it had made, then hoist itself up and begin making a second. It was creating footholds, or tongue-holds, rather. "It's trying to climb the wall," I said. "Good God, it's like the freaking Terminator." "The what?" said Emma. I almost started to explain, then shook my head. It was a stupid comparison anyway. Hollow gas were scarier and probably deadlier than any movie monster. "We have to stop it," said Olive. "Or better yet, run," said Horace. "No more running," said Enoch. "Can we please just kill the damn thing?" "Sure," Emma said, "but how?" "Anyone got a vat of boiling oil?" said Enoch. "Will this do instead?" I heard Bronwyn say, and turned to see her lifting a boulder above her head. "It might," I said. "How's your aim? Can you drop it where I tell you?" "I'll certainly try," Bronwyn said, tottering toward the ledge with the rock balanced precariously on her hands. We stood looking over the edge. "Farther this way," I said, urging her a few steps to the left. Just as I was about to give the signal for her to drop the boulder, though, the hollow leapt from one hole to the next, and now she was standing in the wrong place. The hollow was getting faster at making the holds. Now it was a moving target. To make matters worse, Bronwyn's boulder was the only one in sight. If she missed, we wouldn't get a second shot. I forced myself to stare at the hollow despite a nearly unbearable urge to look away. For a few strange, head-swimmy seconds, the voices of my friends faded away, and I could hear my own blood pumping in my ears and my heart thumping in the cavity of my chest, and my thoughts drifted to the creature that killed my grandfather, that stood over his torn and dying body before fleeing, cowardly, into the woods. My vision rippled, and my hands shook. I tried to steady myself. "You were born for this," I told myself. "You were built to kill monsters like this, I repeated it under my breath like a mantra. "Hurry up, please, Jacob," Bronwyn said. The creature faked left, then jumped right. I didn't want to guess and throw away our best chance to killing it. I wanted to know. And somehow, for some reason, I felt that I could. I knelt, so close to the cliff's edge now that Emma hooked 2 fingers through the back of my belt to keep me from falling. Focusing on the hollow, I repeated the mantra to myself. Built to kill you. Built to kill. And though the hollow was for the moment stationary, hacking away at one spot on the wall, I felt the compass needle in my gut prick ever so slightly to the right of it. It was like a premonition. Bronwyn was beginning to tremble under the boulder's weight. "I can't hold this much longer," she said. I decided to trust my instinct. Even though the spot my compass pointed to was empty, I shouted for Bronwyn to drop the boulder there. She angled toward it, and with a groan of relief, let go of the rock. The moment after she let go, the hollow leapt to the right, into the very place my compass had pointed. The hollow looked up to see the rock sailing toward it and poised to jump again, but there wasn't time. The boulder slammed into the creature's head and swept its body off the wall. With a thunderous crash, hollow and boulder hit the ground together. Tentacle tongues shot out from beneath the rock, shivered, and went limp. Black blood followed, fanning around the boulder in a great vicious puddle. "Direct hit," I yelled. The kids began to jump and cheer. "It's dead, it's dead," Olive cried. "The horrible hollow is dead." Bronwyn threw her arms around me. Emma kissed the top of my head. Horace shook my hand, and Hugh slapped me on the back. Even Enoch congratulated me. "Good work," he said, a bit reluctantly. "Now don't go getting a big head over it." I should have been overjoyed, but I hardly felt anything. Just a spreading numbness as the trembling pain of the feeling receded. Emma could see I was drained. Very sweetly, and in a way no one else could quite detect, she took my arm and half supported me as we walked away from the ledge. "That wasn't luck," she whispered in my ear. "I was right about you, Jacob Portman." The path that had dead-ended at the top of the wall, at the bottom of the wall, began again here at the top, following the spine of a ridge up and over a hill. "The sign on the rope said, 'Access to Menagerie,'" said Horace. "Do you suppose that's what's ahead?" "You're the one who dreams about the future," said Enoch. "Suppose you tell us." "What's a menagerie?" asked Olive. "A collection of animals," Emma explained. "Like a zoo, sort of." Olive squeaked and clapped her hands. "It's Cuthbert's friends from the story. Oh, I can't wait to meet them. Do you suppose that's where the Imbrian lives too?" "At this juncture," Millard said, "it's best not to suppose anything." We started walking. I was still reeling from my encounter with the hollow. My ability did seem to be developing, as Millard said it would, growing like a muscle the more I worked it. Once I'd seen a hollow, I could track it, and if I focused on it in just the right way, I could anticipate its next move, in some felt more than known gut instinctual way. I felt a certain satisfaction at having learned something new about my peculiarity, and with nothing to teach me but experience. But this wasn't a safe, controlled environment I was learning in. There were no bumper lanes to keep my ball out of the gutter. Any mistake I made would have immediate and deadly consequences, for both myself and those around me. I worried the others would start believing the hype about me, or worse yet, I would. And I knew that the minute I got cocky, the minute I stopped being pants-wettingly terrified of Hollowgast, something terrible would happen. Maybe it was lucky then that my terror-to-confidence ratio was at an all-time low. 10-1, easy. I stuck my hands in my pockets as we walked, afraid the others would see them shaking. "Look," said Bronwyn, stopping in the middle of the path. "A house in the clouds." We were halfway up the ridge. Up ahead of us, high in the distance, was a house that almost seemed to be balanced on a cloud bank. As we worked further and crested the hill, the clouds parted and the house came into full view. It was very small and perched not atop a cloud, but a very large tower constructed entirely from stacked-up railroad ties, the whole thing set smack in the middle of a grassy plateau. It was one of the strangest man-made structures I'd ever seen. Around it on the plateau were scattered a few shacks, and at the far end was a small patch of woods, but we paid no attention. Our eyes were on the tower. "What is it?" I whispered. "A lookout tower?" guessed Emma. "A place to launch airplanes from?" said Hugh. But there were no airplanes anywhere, nor any evidence of a landing strip. "Perhaps it's a place to launch zeppelins from," said Millard. I remembered old footage of the ill-fated Hindenburg docking to the top of what looked like a radio tower, a structure not so different from this, and felt a cold wave of dread pass through me. What if the balloons that hunted us on the beach were based here, and we'd unwittingly stumbled into a nest of whites? "Or maybe it's the Imbrian's house," said Olive. "Why does everyone always leap to the awfulest conclusions right away?" "I'm sure Olive's right," said Hugh. "There's nothing to be afraid of here." He was answered right away by a loud, inhuman growl, which seemed to come from the shadows beneath the tower. "What was that?" said Emma. "Another hollow?" "I don't think so," I said, the feeling still fading in me. "I don't know, and I don't want to know," said Horace, backing away. But we didn't have a choice. It wanted to meet us. The growl came again, prickling the hairs on my arms, and a moment later, a furry face appeared between two of the lower railroad ties. It snarled at us like a rabid dog, reels of saliva dripping from its fang-toothed mouth. "What in the name of the elder folk is that?" muttered Emma. "Capital idea coming into this loop," said Enoch. "Really working out well for us so far." The whatever it was crawled out from between the ties and into the sun, where it crouched on its haunches and leered at us with an unbalanced smile, as if imagining how our brains might taste. I couldn't tell if it was human or animal. Dressed in rags, it had the body of a man, but carried itself like an ape, its hunched form like some long-lost ancestor of ours, whose evolution had been arrested millions of years ago. Its eyes and teeth were a dull yellow, its skin pale and blotched with dark spots, its hair a long, matted mess. "Someone make it die," Horace said, "or at least make it quit looking at me." Bronwyn set Claire down and assumed a fighting stance, while Emma held out her hands to make a flame. But she was too stunned, apparently, to summon more than a sputter of smoke. The man-thing tensed, snarled, and then took off like an Olympic sprinter. Not toward us, but around us, diving behind a pile of rocks and popping up again with a fang-bearing grin. It was toying with us, like a cat toys with its prey just before the kill. It seemed about to make another run, at us this time, when a voice from behind commanded it to sit down and behave. And the thing did, relaxing onto its hindquarters, tongue lolling from its mouth into a dopey grin. We turned to see a dog trotting calmly in our direction. I looked past it to see who had spoken, but there was no one. And then the dog itself opened its mouth and said, "Don't mind Grunt. He's got no manners at all. That's just his way of saying thank you. That hollow gas was most bothersome." The dog seemed to be talking to me, but I was too surprised to respond. Not only was it speaking in an almost human voice, and a refined British one at that, but it held in its jowly mouth a pipe, and on its face were a pair of round green-tinted glasses. "Oh dear, I hope you're not too offended," the dog continued, misinterpreting my silence. "Grunt means well, but you'll have to excuse him. He was quite literally raised in a barn. I, on the other hand, was educated on a grand estate, the seventh pup of the seventh pup in an illustrious line of hunting dogs." He bowed as well as a dog could, dipping his nose to the ground. "Addison McHenry, at your humble service." "That's a fancy name for a dog," said Enoch, apparently unimpressed to meet a talking animal. Addison peered over his glasses at Enoch and said, "And by what appellation, dare I ask, are you denominated?" "Enoch O'Connor," Enoch said proudly, sticking his chest out a little. "That's a fancy name for a grimy, pudged-faced boy," Addison said, and then he stood up on his hind legs, rising nearly to Enoch's height. "I am a dog, yes, but a peculiar one. Why, then, should I be saddled with a common dog's name? My former master called me Boxy, and I despised it, an assault on my dignity. So I bit him on the face and took his name. Addison, much more befitting an animal of my intellectual prowess, I think. That was just before Miss Wren discovered me and brought me here." Faces brightened at the mention of an Imbrian's name, a pulse of hope firing through us. "Miss Wren brought you?" said Olive. "But what about Cuthbert the giant?" "Who?" Addison said, and then he shook his head. "Ah, right, the story. It's just that, I'm afraid, a story, inspired long ago by that curious rock down below, and Miss Wren's peculiar menagerie." "Told you," muttered Enoch. "Where's Miss Wren now?" Emma said. "We've got to speak to her." Addison looked up at the house atop the tower and said, "That's her residence, but she isn't home at the moment. She winged off some days ago to help her Imbrian sisters in London. There's a war on, you see. I assume you've heard all about it, which explains why you're traveling in the degraded style of refugees." "Our loop was raided," said Emma, "and then we lost our things at sea." "And nearly ourselves," Millard added. At the sound of Millard's voice, the dog startled. "An invisible! What a rare surprise! And an American, too," he said, nodding at me. "What a peculiar lot you are, even for peculiars." He fell back onto all fours and turned toward the tower. "Come, I'll introduce you to the others. They'll be absolutely fascinated to meet you. And you must be famished by your journey, poor creatures. Nutrifying provender shall be forthcoming." "We need medicine, too," said Bronwyn, kneeling to pick up Claire. "This little one is very ill." "We'll do all we can for her," the dog said. "We owe you that and more for solving our little hollow gas problem. Most bothersome, as I was saying." "Nutrifying what did he say?" said Olive. "Sustenance, comestibles, rations," the dog replied. "You'll eat like royalty here." "But I don't like dog food," said Olive. Addison laughed, the timbre surprisingly human. "Neither do I, miss." End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Addison walked on all fours with his snub nose in the air, while the man thing called Grunt scampered around us like a psychotic puppy. From behind tufts of grass and the shacks scattered here and there, I could see faces peeking out at us. Furry, most of them, and of all different shapes and sizes. When we came to the middle of the plateau, Addison reared up on its hind legs and called out, "Don't be afraid, fellows. Come and meet the children who dispatched our unwelcome visitor. One by one, a parade of bizarre animals ventured out into the open. Addison introduced them as they came. The first creature looked like the top half of a miniature giraffe, sutured onto the bottom half of a donkey. It walked awkwardly on two hind legs, its only limbs. "This is Deirdre," said Addison. "She's an emu raff, which is a bit like a donkey and a giraffe put together, only with fewer legs and a peevish temper. She's a terrible sore loser at cards," he added in a whisper. "Never play an emu raff at cards. Say hello, Deirdre." "Goodbye," Deirdre said, her big horse lips pulling back into a bucktooth grin. "Terrible day. Very displeased to meet you." Then she laughed a braying, high-pitched whinny and said, "Only teasing." "Deirdre thinks she's quite funny," Addison explained. "If you're like a donkey and a giraffe," said Olive, "then why aren't you called a donkey raff?" Deirdre frowned and answered, "Because what kind of awful name is that? Emu raff rolls off the tongue, don't you think?" And then she stuck out her tongue, fat, pink, and 3 feet long, and pushed Olive's tiara back on her head with its tip. Olive squealed and ran behind Bronwyn, giggling. "Do all the animals here talk?" I asked. "Just Deirdre and I," Addison said. "And a good thing, too. The chickens won't shut up as it is, and they can't say a word." Right on cue, a flock of clucking chickens bobbled toward us from a burned and blackened coop. "Ah," said Addison, "here come the girls now." "What happened to their coop?" Emma asked. "Every time we repair it, they burn it down again," he said. "Such a bother." Addison turned and nodded in the other direction. "You might want to back away a bit. When they get excited—" Bang! A sound like a quarter stick of dynamite going off made us all jump, and the coop's last few undamaged boards splintered and flew into the air. "Their eggs go off," he finished. When the smoke cleared, we saw the chickens still coming towards us, unhurt and seemingly unsurprised by the blast, a little cloud of feathers wafting around them like fat snowflakes. Enoch's jaw fell open. "Are you telling me these chickens lay exploding eggs?" he said. "Only when they get excited," said Addison. "Most of their eggs are quite safe and delicious. But it was the exploding ones that earned them their rather unkind name, Armageddon chickens." "Keep away from us," Emma shouted as the chickens closed in. "You'll blow us all up." Addison laughed. "They're sweet and harmless, I assure you, and they don't lay anywhere but inside their coop." The chickens clucked happily around our feet. "You see," the dog said, "they like you." "This is a madhouse," said Horace. Deirdre laughed. "No, Devling, it's a menagerie." Then Addison introduced us to a few animals whose peculiarities were subtler, including an owl who watched us from a branch, silent and intense, and a cater of mice who seemed to fade subtly in and out of view, as if they spent half their time on some other plane of reality. There was a goat, too, with very long horns and deep black eyes, an orphan from a herd of peculiar goats who once roamed the forest below. When all the animals were assembled, Addison cried, "3 cheers for the hollow killers!" Deirdre brayed, and the goat stamped the ground, and the owl hooted, and the chickens clucked, and Grunt grunted his appreciation. And while all this was going on, Bronwyn and Emma kept trading looks. Bronwyn glancing down at her coat, where Miss Peregrine was hiding, and then raising her eyebrows at Emma to ask, "Now?" And Emma shaking her head in reply, "Not quite yet." Bronwyn laid Claire in a patch of grass beneath a shade tree. She was sweating and shivering, fading in and out of consciousness. "There's a special elixir I've seen Miss Wren prepare for treating fever," Addison said. "Foul tasting, but effective." My mom used to make me chicken soup, I offered. The chicken squawked with alarm, and Addison shot me a nasty look. He was joking, he said. Only joking. Such an absurd joke. Ha ha. There's no such thing as chicken soup. With the help of Grunt and his opposable thumbs, Addison and the emu raff went to prepare the elixir. In a little while, they returned with a bowl of what looked like dirty dishwater. Once Claire had drunk every drop and fallen back asleep, the animals laid out a modest feast for us. Baskets of fresh bread and stewed apples and hard-boiled eggs, of the non-exploding variety, all served straight into our hands as they had no plates or silverware. I didn't realize how hungry I'd been until I wolfed down 3 eggs and a loaf of bread in under 5 minutes. When I was done, I belched and wiped my mouth and looked up to see all the animals looking back, watching us eagerly, their faces so alive with intelligence that I went a little numb and had to fight an overwhelming sensation that I was dreaming. Millard was eating next to me, and I turned to him and asked, "Before this, had you ever heard of peculiar animals?" "Only in children's stories," he said, through a mouthful of bread. "How strange, then, that it was one such story that led us to them." Only Olive seemed unfazed by it all, perhaps because she was still so young, or part of her was anyway, and the distance between stories and real life did not yet seem so great. "Where are the other animals?" she asked Addison. "In Cuthbert's tale there were stilt-legged grimbears and 2-headed lynxes." And just like that, the animal's jubilant mood wilted. Grunt hid his face in his big hands, and Deirdre let out a neighing groan. Don't ask," she said, hanging her long head. But it was too late. "These children helped us," Addison said. "They deserve to hear our sad story if they wish." "If you don't mind telling us," said Emma. "I love sad stories," said Enoch, "especially ones where princesses get eaten by dragons and everyone dies in the end." Addison cleared his throat. "In our case, it's more that the dragon got eaten by the princess," he said. "It's been a rough few years for the likes of us, and it was a rough few centuries prior to that." The dog paced back and forth, his voice taking on a preacherly kind of grandness. "Once upon a time, this world was full of peculiar animals. In the olden days, there were more peculiar animals on Earth than there were peculiar folk. We came in every shape and size you could imagine. Whales that could fly like birds, worms as big as houses, dogs twice as intelligent as I am, if you can believe it. Some had kingdoms all their own, ruled over by animal leaders. A spark moved behind the dog's eyes, barely detectable, as if he were old enough to remember the world in such a state. And then he sighed deeply, the spark snuffed, and continued, "But our numbers are not a fraction of what they were. We have fallen into near extinction. Do any of you know what became of the peculiar animals that once roamed the world?" We chewed silently, ashamed that we didn't. "Right then," he said. "Come with me and I'll show you." And he trotted out into the sun and looked back, waiting for us to follow. "Please, Addie," said the emu raff. "Not now. Our guests are eating." "They asked, and now I'm telling them," said Addison. "Their bread will still be here in a few minutes." Reluctantly, we put down our food and followed the dog. Fiona stayed behind to watch Claire, who was still sleeping. And with Grunt and the emu raff loping after us, we crossed the plateau to the little patch of woods that grew at the far edge. A gravel path wound through the trees, and we crouched along it toward a clearing. Just before we reached it, Addison said, "May I introduce you to the finest peculiar animals who ever lived?" And the trees parted to reveal a small graveyard filled with neat rows of white headstones. "Oh no," I heard Bronwyn say. There are probably more peculiar animals buried here than are currently alive in all of Europe, Addison said, moving through the graves to reach one in particular, which he leaned on with his forepaws. This one's name was Pompey. She was a fine dog, and could heal wounds with a few licks of her tongue. A wonder to behold. And yet this is how she was treated. Addison clicked his tongue, and Grunt scurried forward with a little book in his hands, which he thrust into mine. It was a photo album, open to a picture of a dog that had been harnessed, like a mule or a horse, to a little wagon. She was enslaved by carnival folk, Addison said, forced to pull fat, spoiled children like some common beast of burden, whipped even with riding crops. His eyes burned with anger. By the time Miss Wren rescued her, Pompey was so depressed she was nearly dead from it. She lingered on for only a few weeks after she arrived, then was interred here. I passed the book around. Everyone who saw the photo sighed or shook their head or muttered bitterly to themselves. Addison crossed to another grave. Grander still was Kaab Magda, he said, an 18-tusked wildebeest who roamed the loops of outer Mongolia. She was terrifying. The ground thundered under her hooves when she ran. They say she even marched over the Alps with Hannibal's army in 218 BC. Then some years ago, a hunter shot her. Grunt showed us a picture of an older woman who looked like she'd just gotten back from an African safari, seated in a bizarre chair made of horns. I don't understand, said Emma, peering at the photo. Where's Kaab Magda? Being sat upon, said Addison. The hunter fashioned her horns into a chair. Emma nearly dropped the album. That's disgusting. If that's her, said Enoch, tapping the photo, then what's buried here? The chair, said Addison. What a pitiful waste of a peculiar life. This burying ground is filled with stories like Magda's, Addison said. Miss Wren meant this menagerie to be an ark, but gradually it's become a tomb. Like all our loops, said Enoch. Like peculiardom itself. A failed experiment. This place is dying, Miss Wren often said. Addison's voice rose in imitation of her. And I am nothing but the overseer of its long funeral. Addison's eyes glistened, remembering her, but just as quickly went hard again. She was very theatrical. Please don't refer to our Imbrine in the past tense, Deirdre said. Sorry, is. They hunted you, said Emma, her voice wavering with emotion. Stuffed you and put you in zoos. Just like the hunters did in Cuthbert's story, said Olive. Yes, said Addison. Some truths are expressed best in the form of myth. But there was no Cuthbert, said Olive, beginning to understand. No giant, just a bird. A very special bird, said Deirdre. You're worried about her, I said. Of course we are, said Addison. To my knowledge, Miss Wren is the only remaining uncaptured Imbrine. When she heard that her kidnapped sisters had been spirited away to London, she flew off to render assistance without a moment's thought for her own safety. Nor ours, Deirdre muttered. London, said Emma. Are you sure that's where the kidnapped Imbrines were taken? Absolutely certain, the dog replied. Miss Wren has spies in the city, a certain flock of peculiar pigeons who watch everything and report back to her. Recently, several came to us in a state of horrible distress. They had it on good information that the Imbrines were, and still are, being held in the punishment loops. Several of the children gasped, but I had no idea what the dog meant. What's a punishment loop? I asked. They were designed to hold captured whites, hardened criminals, and the dangerously insane, Millard explained. They're nothing like the loops we know. Nasty, nasty places. And now it is the whites, and undoubtedly their hollows, who are guarding them, said Addison. Good God, exclaimed Horace. Then it's worse than we feared. Are you joking? Said Enoch. This is precisely the sort of thing I feared. Whatever nefarious end the whites are seeking, Addison said, it's clear that they need all the inbrains to accomplish it. Now only Miss Wren is left. Brave, foolhardy Miss Wren. And who knows for how long? Then he whimpered the way some dogs do during thunderstorms, tucking his ears back and lowering his head. We went back to the shade tree and finished our meals, and when we were stuffed and couldn't eat another bite, Bronwyn turned to Addison and said, You know, Mr. Dog, everything's not quite as dire as you say. Then she looked at Emma and raised her eyebrows, and this time Emma nodded. Is that so? Addison replied. Yes, it is. In fact, I have something right here that might cheer you up. I rather doubt that, the dog muttered, but he lifted his head from his paws to see what it was anyway. Bronwyn opened her coat and said, I'd like you to meet the second to last uncaptured Imbrine, Miss Alma Peregrine. The bird poked her head into the sunlight and blinked. Now it was the animal's turn to be amazed. Deirdre gasped, and Grunt squealed and clapped his hands, and the chickens flapped their useless wings. But we heard your loop was raided, Addison said. Your Imbrine stolen. She was, Emma said proudly, but we stole her back. In that case, said Addison, bowing to Miss Peregrine, it is a most extraordinary pleasure, madam. I am your servant. Should you require a place to change, I'll happily show you to Miss Wren's private quarters. She can't change, said Bronwyn. What's that? Said Addison. Is she shy? No, said Bronwyn. She's stuck. The pipe dropped from Addison's mouth. Oh no, he said quietly. Are you quite certain? She's been like this for 2 days now, said Emma. I think if she could change back, she would have done it by now. Addison shook the glasses from his face and peered at the bird, his eyes wide with concern. May I examine her? He asked. He's a regular Dr. Doolittle, said the emu Raff. Addie treats us all when we're sick. Bronwyn lifted Miss Peregrine out of her coat and set the bird on the ground. Just be careful of her hurt wing, she said. Of course, said Addison. He began by making a slow circle around the bird, studying her from every angle. Then she sniffed her head and wings with his big, wet nose. Tell me what happened to her, he said finally, and when and how. Tell me all of it. Emma recounted the whole story, how Miss Peregrine was kidnapped by Golan, how she nearly drowned in her cage in the ocean, how we rescued her from a submarine piloted by whites. The animals listened, rapt. When we'd finished, the dog took a moment to gather his thoughts, then delivered his diagnosis. She's been poisoned, I'm certain of it, dosed with something that's keeping her in bird form artificially. Really? Said Emma. How do you know? To kidnap and transport Imbrines is a dangerous business when they're in human form and can perform their time-stopping tricks. As birds, however, their powers are very limited. This way, your mistress is compact, easily hidden, much less of a threat. He looked at Miss Peregrine. Did the white who took you spray you with anything? He asked her. A liquid or a gas? Miss Peregrine bobbed her head in the air, what seemed to be a nod. Bronwyn gasped. Oh, miss, I'm so awfully sorry. We had no idea. I felt a stab of guilt. I had led the whites to the island. I was the reason this had happened to Miss Peregrine. I had caused the peculiar children to lose their home, at least partly. The shame of it lodged like a stone in my throat. I said, "She'll get better, though, won't she? She'll turn back." "Her wing will mend," Addison replied, "but without help, she won't turn human again." "What sort of help does she need?" Emma asked. "Can you give it to her?" "Only another Imbrine can assist her, and she's running very short on time." I tensed. This was something new. "What do you mean?" Emma said. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news," said Addison, "but 2 days is a very long time for an Imbrine to be arrested like this. The more time she spends as a bird, the more her human self will be lost. Her memory, her words, everything that made her who she was, until eventually she won't be an Imbrine at all anymore. She'll just be a bird, for good and ever." An image came to me of Miss Peregrine splayed on an emergency room table, buzzed around by doctors. Her breathing stopped, every second that ticked by doing her brain some new and irreparable harm. "How long?" asked Millard. "How much longer does she have?" Addison squinted, shook his head. 2 days, if she's strong." Whispers and gasps. We collectively went pale. "Are you sure?" said Emma. "Are you absolutely, positively certain?" "I've seen it happen before." Addison padded over to the little owl, who was perched on a branch nearby. "Olivia here was a young Imbrine who had a bad accident during her training. They brought her to us 5 days later. Miss Wren and I did everything we could to try to change her back, but she was beyond help. That was 10 years ago. She's been this way ever since." The owl stared mutely. There was no life in her anymore beyond that of an animal. You could see it in the dullness of her eyes. Emma stood. She seemed about to say something, to rally us, I hoped, kick us into action with some inspiring speech, but she couldn't seem to get the words out. Choking back a sob, she stumbled away from us. I called after her, but she didn't stop. The others just watched her go, stunned by the terrible news. Stunned, too, by any sign of weakness or indecision from Emma. She had maintained her strength in the face of all this for so long that we had come to take it for granted. But she wasn't bulletproof. She might have been peculiar, but she was also human. "You'd better fetch her, Mr. Jacob," Bronwyn said to me. "We mustn't linger here too long." When I caught up to Emma, she was standing near the plateau's edge, gazing out at the countryside below, sloping green hills falling away to a distant plain. She heard me coming, but she didn't look back. I shuffled up next to her and tried to think of something comforting to say. "I know you're scared, and 3 days doesn't seem like a long time, but—" 2 days, she said. 2 days, maybe. Her lip trembled. "And that's not even the worst of it." I balked. How could things possibly be worse? She'd been waging a battle against tears, but now, in a sudden break, she lost it. She sank to the ground and sobbed, a storm overtaking her. I knelt and wrapped my arms around her and hung on. "I'm so sorry," she said, repeating it 3 times, her voice raw, a fraying rope. "You never should have stayed. I shouldn't have let you, but I was selfish, so terribly selfish." "Don't say that," I said. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." That's only seemed to make her cry harder. I pressed my lips to her forehead and kissed it until the storm began to pass out of her, the sobs fading to whimpers. "Please, talk to me," I said. "Tell me what's wrong." After a minute, she sat up, wiped her eyes, and tried to compose herself. "I had hoped I'd never have to say this," she said, that it wouldn't matter. Do you remember when I told you, the night you decided to come with us, that you might never be able to go home again? Of course I do. I didn't know until just now how true that really was. I'm afraid I've doomed you, Jacob, my sweet friend, to a short life trapped in a dying world. She drew a quivering breath and then continued. You came to us through Miss Peregrine's loop, and that means only Miss Peregrine or her loop can send you back. But her loop is gone now, or if it isn't yet, it will be soon, which leaves Miss Peregrine herself as your only way home. But if she never turns human again— I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Then I'm stuck in the past. Yes, and the only way to return to the time you knew as your own would be to wait for it, day by day, year by year. 70 years. By then, my parents and everyone I ever knew or cared about would be dead, and I'd be long dead to all of them. Of course, provided we survived whatever tribulations we were about to face, I could always go and find my parents in a few decades once they were born. But what would be the point? They'd be children and strangers to me. I wondered when my present-day back-home parents would give up on finding me alive. What story they'd tell themselves to make sense of my disappearance. Had I run away? Gone insane? Thrown myself off a sea cliff? Would they have a funeral for me? Buy me a coffin? Write my name on a gravestone? I'd become a mystery that would never solve, a wound that would never heal. I'm so sorry, Emma said again. If I'd known Miss Peregrine's condition was so dire, I swear to you, I never would have asked you to stay. The present means nothing to the rest of us. It'll kill us if we stay there too long. But you still have a family, a life. No, I said, shouting, slapping the ground with my hand, chasing away the self-pitying thoughts that had started to cloud my head. That's all gone now. I choose this. Emma laid her hand atop mine and said gently, if what the animals say is true, and all our inbrains have been kidnapped, soon even this won't be here. She gathered some dirt in her hand and scattered it in the breeze. Without inbrains to maintain them, our loops will collapse. The whites will use the inbrains to recreate their damn experiment, and it'll be 1908 all over again. And either they'll fail and turn all creation into a smoking crater, or they'll succeed and make themselves immortal, and will be ruled by those monsters. Either way, before long, we'll be more extinct than the peculiar animals. And now I've dragged you into this hopeless mess. And for what? Everything happens for a reason, I said. I couldn't believe those words had come out of my mouth. But as soon as they were spoken, I felt the truth of them, resonating in me loud as a bell. I was here for a reason. There was something I was meant not simply to be, but to do. And it wasn't to run or hide or give up the minute things that seemed terrifying and impossible. I thought you didn't believe in destiny, said Emma, assessing me skeptically. I didn't, not exactly, but I wasn't quite sure how to explain what I did believe either. I thought back to the stories my grandfather used to tell me. They were filled with wonder and adventure, but something deeper ran through them as well, a sense of abiding gratitude. As a kid, I'd focused on Grandpa Porton's descriptions of magical-sounding island and peculiar children with fantastic powers. But at heart, his stories were about Miss Peregrine and how, in a time of great need, she had helped him. When he arrived in Wales, my grandfather had been a young, frightened boy who didn't speak the language. A boy hunted by two kinds of monsters. One that would eventually kill most of his family, and the other, cartoonishly grotesque and invisible to all but him, which must have seemed lifted directly from his nightmares. In the face of all this, Miss Peregrine had hidden him, given him a home, and helped him discover who he really was. She had saved his life, and in doing so had enabled my father's life, and by extension my own. My parents had birthed and raised and loved me, and for that I owed them a debt. But I would never have been born in the first place if not for the great and selfless kindness Miss Peregrine had shown my grandfather. I was coming to believe I had been sent here to repay that debt, my own, my father's, and my grandfather's too. I tried my best to explain. It's not about destiny, I said, but I do think there's a balance in the world, and sometimes forces we don't understand intervene to tip the scales the right way. Miss Peregrine saved my father, my grandfather, and now I'm here to help save her. Emma narrowed her eyes and nodded slowly. I couldn't tell if she was agreeing with me or thinking of a polite way to tell me I'd lost my mind. Then she hugged me. I didn't need to explain any further. She understood. She owed Miss Peregrine her life, too. We've got 3 days, I said. We'll go to London, free one of the Imbrines, and fix Miss Peregrine. It's not hopeless. We'll save her, Emma, or we'll die trying. The words sounded so brave and resolute that for a moment I wondered if it was really me who'd said them. Emma surprised me by laughing, as if this struck her as funny somehow, and then she looked away for a moment. When she looked back, her jaw was set and her eyes shone. Her old confidence was returning. Sometimes I can't decide whether you're completely mad or some sort of miracle, she said. Though I'm starting to think it's the latter. She put her arms around me again, and we held each other for a long moment, her head on my shoulder, breath warm on my neck, and suddenly I wanted nothing more than to close all the little gaps that existed between our bodies, to collapse into one being. But then she pulled away and kissed my forehead and started back toward the others. I was too dazed to follow right away, because there was something new happening, a wheel inside my heart I never noticed before, and it was spinning so fast it made me dizzy. And the farther away she got, the faster it spun, like there was an invisible cord unreeling from it that stretched between us, and if she went too far it would snap and kill me. I wonder if this strange, sweet pain was love. The others were clustered together beneath the shade tree, children and animals together. Emma and I strode toward them. I had an impulse to link arms with her, and nearly did, before something caught me and I thought better of it. I was suddenly aware, as Enoch turned to look at us with that certain suspicion he always reserved for me now, and now increasingly for both of us, that Emma and I were becoming a unit apart from the others, a private alliance with its own secrets and promises. Bronwyn stood as we approached. "Are you all right, Miss Emma?" Yes, Emma said quickly. "Had something caught in my eye, was all. Now everyone gather your things. We must go to London at once and see about making Miss Peregrine whole again." "We're thrilled you agree," Enoch said with an eye roll. "We came to the same conclusion several minutes ago while you two were over there whispering." Emma flushed, but she declined to take Enoch's bait. There were more important things to attend to now than petty conflicts, namely, the many exotic dangers of the journey we were about to undertake. "As I'm sure you're all aware," Emma said, This is by most standards a very poor plan with very little hope of success. She laid out some of the reasons why. London was far away. Not by the standards of the present-day world, maybe, when we might have GPS'd our way to the nearest train station and caught an express that would have whisked us away into the city in a few hours. In 1940, though, in a Britain convulsed by war, London was a world away. The roads and rails might be clogged by refugees, or ruined by bombs, or monopolized by military convoys, any of which would cost us time Miss Peregrine didn't have time to spare. Worse, we would be hunted, and even more intensely than we had already been, now that nearly all of the other Imbrians had been captured. Forget the journey, said Addison. That's the least of your worries. Perhaps I was not sufficiently dissuasive when we discussed this earlier. Perhaps you do not fully understand the circumstances of the Imbrian's incarceration. He enunciated each syllable as if we were hard of hearing. Haven't any of you read about the punishment loops in your peculiar history books? Of course we have, said Emma. Then you'll know that attempting to breach them is tantamount to suicide. They're death traps, every one of them, containing the very bloodiest episodes from London's history. The Great Fire of 1666, the exceedingly lethal Viking siege of 842, the pestilent height of the terrible plague. They don't publish temporal maps of these places for obvious reasons. So unless one of you has a working knowledge of the secretest parts of peculiardom. I am a student of obscure and unpleasant loops, Millard spoke up. Been a pet hobby for many years. Bully for you, said Addison. Then I suppose you have a way to get past the horde of hollows who'll be guarding their entrances as well. Suddenly it felt like everyone's eyes were on me. I swallowed hard, kept my chin high, and said, Yeah, in fact, we do. We'd better, grumbled Enoch. Then Bronwyn said, I believe in you, Jacob. I haven't known you too long, but I feel I know your heart, and it's a strong, true thing, a peculiar heart, and I trust you. She leaned against me and hugged my shoulder with one arm, and I felt my throat tighten. Thank you, I said, feeling lame and small in the face of her big emotion. The dog clucked his tongue. Madness. You children have no self-preservation instincts at all. It's a wonder any of you are still breathing. Emma stepped in front of Addison and tried to shut him down. Yes, wonderful, she said. Thank you for illuminating us with your opinion. Now, doomsaying aside, I have to ask the rest of you. Are there any objections to what we're proposing? I don't want anyone volunteering because they feel pressured. Slowly, timidly, Horace raised his hand. If London is where all the whites are, won't going there be walking right into their hands? Is that a good idea? It's a genius idea, Enoch said irritably. The whites are convinced we peculiar children are docile and weak. Us coming after them is the last thing they'd expect. And if we fail, said Horace, we'll have hand-delivered Miss Peregrine right to their doorstep. We don't know that, said Hugh, that London is their doorstep. Enoch snorted. Don't sugarcoat things. If they've broken open the prison loops and they're using them to keep our Imbrians, then you can bet your soft parts they're overrun the rest of the city too. It'll be absolutely crawling with them, mark my words. If it weren't, the whites would never have bothered coming after us in little old Cairnholm. It's basic military strategy. In battle, you don't aim for the enemy's pinky toe first. You stab him right through the heart. Please, Horace moaned. Enough talk of smashing loops and stabbing hearts. You'll frighten the little ones. I ain't scared, said Olive. Horace shrank into himself. Someone muttered the word coward. None of that, Emma said sharply. There's nothing wrong with being frightened. It means you're taking this very serious thing we're proposing very seriously. Because yes, it will be dangerous. Yes, the chances of success are abysmal. And should we even make it to London, there's no guarantee we'll be able to find the Imbrines, much less rescue one. It's entirely likely that we'll end our days wasting away in some whitish prison cell or dissolved in the belly of a hallowgast. Everyone got that? Grim nods of understanding. Am I sugarcoating anything, Enoch? Enoch shook his head. If we try this, Emma went on, we may well lose Miss Peregrine. That much is uncontroversial. But if we don't try, if we don't go, then there's no question we'll lose her, and the whites will likely catch us anyway. That said, anyone who doesn't feel up to it can stay behind. She meant Horace, and we all knew it. Horace stared at a spot on the ground. You can stay here where it's safe, and we'll come collect you later when the trouble's through. There's no shame in it. My left ventricle, said Horace. If I sat this out, I'd never live it down. Even Claire refused to be left behind. I've just had 80 years of pleasantly boring days, she said, raising up on one elbow from the shady spot where she'd been sleeping. Stay here while the rest of you go adventuring? Not a chance. But when she tried to stand, she found she couldn't, and lay back again, coughing and dizzy. Though the dishwatery liquid she drank had cooled her fever some, there was no way she'd be able to make the journey to London. Not today, not tomorrow, and certainly not in time to help Miss Peregrine. Someone would have to stay behind with Claire while she recuperated. Emma asked for volunteers. Olive raised her hand, but Bronwyn told her to forget it. She was too young. Bronwyn started to raise her own hand, then thought better of it. She was torn, she said, between wanting to protect Claire and her sense of duty to Miss Peregrine. Enoch elbowed Horace. What's the matter with you? Enoch taunted. Here's your big chance to stay behind. I want to go adventuring, I really and truly do, but I should also like to see my 105th birthday, if at all possible. Promise we won't try to save the whole blasted world? We just want to save Miss P, said Emma. But I make no guarantees about anyone's birthday. Horace seemed satisfied with this, and his hands stayed planted at his sides. Anyone else? Said Emma, looking around. It's all right, Claire said. I can manage on my own. Out of the question, said Emma. We peculiars stick together. Fiona's hand drifted up. She'd been so quiet, I'd nearly forgotten she was sitting with us. Fee, you can't, said Hugh. He looked hurt, as if by volunteering to stay behind, she was rejecting him. She looked at him with big, sad eyes, but her hands stayed up in the air. Thank you, Fiona, said Emma. With any luck, we'll see you both again in just a few days. Bird willing, said Bronwyn. Bird willing, echoed the others. Afternoon was slipping toward evening. In an hour, the animals' loop would be dark, and finding our way down the mountain would be much more dangerous. As we made preparations to leave, the animals kindly outfitted us with stores of fresh food and sweaters spun from the wool of peculiar sheep, which Deirdre swore had some peculiar property, though what exactly it was she couldn't quite remember. Impervious to fire, I think? Or perhaps water? Yes, they never sink in water, like fluffy little life jackets. Or maybe, I don't know, they're warm in any case. We thanked her and folded them in Bronwyn's trunk. Then Grunt came loping forward, holding a package wrapped up with paper and twine. A gift from the chickens, Deirdre explained, winking as Grunt passed it into my hands. Don't drop it. A smarter person than I might have thought twice about bringing explosives along on our trip, but we were feeling vulnerable. And both the dog and emu Raph swore that if we were gentle with the eggs, they wouldn't go off. So we nestled them carefully between the sweaters in Bronwyn's trunk. Now at least we wouldn't have to face men with guns without weapons of our own. Then we were nearly ready, except for one thing. When we left the animals' loop, we'd be just as lost as when we'd come in. We needed directions. I can show you the way out of the forest, said Addison. Meet me at the top of Miss Wren's tower. The space up top was so small that only 2 of us could fit at a time. So Emma and I went, climbing its railroad ties like the rungs of a giant ladder. Grunt monkeyed his way up in half the time, delivering Addison to the top under one arm. The view from the top was amazing. To the east, forested slopes stretched away to a vast barren plain. To the west, you could see all the way to the ocean, where an old-looking ship, rigged with giant, complicated sails, glided down the coast. I'd never asked what year it was here. 1492? 1750? Though, to the animals, I guess it hardly mattered. This was a safe place apart from the world of people, and only in the world of people did the year make any difference. You'll head north, Addison said, jabbing his pipe in the direction of a road, just visible, tracing through the trees below, like a faint pencil-drawn line. Down that road is a town, and in that town, in your time anyway, is a train station. Your medium of interloop travel is when? 1940? That's right, Emma replied. Though I only vaguely understood what they were talking about, I'd never been afraid to ask dumb questions. Why can't we just go out into this world? I asked. Travel to London through whatever year it is here. The only way is by horse and carriage, said Addison, which takes several days and causes considerable chafing in my experience. I'm afraid you don't have that much time to spare. He turned and nosed open the door to the tower's little shack. Please, he said. There's one more thing I'd like to show you. We followed him inside. The shack was modest and tiny, a far cry from Miss Peregrine's queenly setup. The entirety of its furniture was a small bed, a wardrobe, and a roll-top desk. A telescope sat mounted on a tripod, aimed out the window. Miss Wren's lookout station, where she watched for trouble, and the comings and goings of her spy pigeons. Addison went to the desk. Should you have any difficulty locating the road, he said, there's a map of the forest in here. Emma opened the desk and found the map, an old, yellowed roll of paper. Underneath it was a creased snapshot. It showed a woman in a black sequined shawl with gray-streaked hair worn in a dramatic upsweep. She was standing next to a chicken. At first glance, the photo looked like a discard, taken during an off moment when the woman was looking away with her eyes closed. And yet, there was something just right about it, too. How the woman's hair and clothes matched the black and white speckle of the chicken's feathers. How she and the chicken were facing opposite directions, implying some odd connection between them, as if they were speaking without words, dreaming at one another. This clearly was Miss Wren. Addison saw the photo and seemed to wince. I could tell he was worried for her, much more than he wanted to admit. Please don't take this as an endorsement of your suicidal plans, he said. But if you should succeed in your mad quest, and should happen to encounter Miss Wren along the way, you might you consider... We'll send her home, Emma said, and then scratched him on the head. It was a perfectly normal thing to do to a dog, but seemed a strange thing to do to a talking one. Dog bless you, Addison replied. Then I tried petting him, but he reared up on his hind legs and said, "Do you mind? Keep your hands at bay, sir." "Sorry," I mumbled, and in the awkward moment that followed, it became obvious that it was time to go. We climbed down the tower to join our friends, where we exchanged tearful goodbyes with Claire and Fiona under the big shade tree. By now, Claire had been given a cushion and a blanket to lie on, and like a princess, she received us one by one at her makeshift bedside on the ground, extracting promises as we knelt down beside her. "Promise you'll come back," she said to me when it was my turn, "and promise you'll save Miss Peregrine." "I'll try my best," I said. "That isn't good enough," she said sternly. "I'll come back," I said. "I promise." "And save Miss Peregrine." "And save Miss Peregrine," I repeated, though the words felt empty. The more confident I tried to sound, the less confident I actually felt. "Good," she said with a nod. "It's been awfully nice knowing you, Jacob, and I'm glad you came to stay." "Me too," I said. And then I got up quickly because her bright blonde-framed face was so earnest it killed me. She believed, unequivocally, everything we told her, that she and Fiona would be all right here, among these strange animals, in a loop abandoned by its imbrine, that we'd return for them. I hoped with all my heart that it was more than just theater, staged to make this hard thing we had to do seem possible. Hugh and Fiona stood off to one side, their hands linked and foreheads touching, saying goodbye in their own quiet way. Finally, we'd all finished with Claire and were ready to go, but no one wanted to disturb them, so we stood watching as Fiona pulled away from Hugh, shook a few seeds from her nest of wild hair, and grew a rose bush heavy with red flowers right where they stood. Hugh's bees rushed to pollinate it, and while they were occupied, as if she'd done it just so they could have a moment to themselves, Fiona embraced him and whispered something in his ear, and Hugh nodded and whispered something back. When they finally turned and saw all of us looking, Fiona blushed, and Hugh came toward us with his hands jammed in his pockets, his bees trailing behind him, and growled, "Let's go, show's over." We began our trek down the mountain just as dusk was falling. The animals accompanied us as far as the sheer rock wall. Olive said to them, "Won't you all come with us?" The emu raft snorted. "We wouldn't last 5 minutes out there. You can at least hope to pass for normal. But one look at me." She wiggled her forearmless body. "I'd be shot, stuffed, and mountained in no time." Then the dog approached Emma and said, "If I could ask one last thing of you." "You've been so kind," she replied. "Anything." "Would you mind terribly lighting my pipe? We have no matches here. I haven't had a real smoke in years." Emma obliged him, touching a lit finger to the bowl of his pipe. The dog took a long, satisfied puff and said, "Best of luck to you, peculiar children." End of chapter 4.